So how do we go about animating a camera? Well, let's get rid of our 80mm and just turn our 24mm lens back on. And I'll just walk you through the different properties we have. For now, I don't need the 2-up view, so I'm going to change this back down to 1 view so we can see this nice and big, and just expand this up a little and twirl down my camera contents. So we have 2 categories, transform controls and camera options. Transform controls are not unique to cameras. You get them with basically every type of layer in After Effects, but the camera options, obviously, those are unique to camera layers. Let's start with just the transform controls. I'll twirl that down and we see stuff that's very familiar. Position, orientation, and then rotation. There's no scale because you can't scale the camera up or down. And there's no opacity or transparency because there's nothing to add transparency to. So just the position and rotation basically. And because this is a 3-dimensional layer, we have X, Y, and Z coordinates for the position. We have X, Y, and Z for the orientation. And then we have X, Y, and Z rotation all separated out. So let's start with position. Obviously we have X and Y position. Moving this on the X axis moves the camera left and right. The Y axis moves it up and down. And the Z axis moves it in and out. Nothing new there. This is the same as modifying these properties using the camera track X, Y, or Z camera tools. You know, it's just modifying those properties. You can just do them down here as well, just like any other layer. Now with 3D layers, not just cameras, you're going to have an orientation and then the 3 different rotations. So if I press R on one of these sun layers, you're gonna see the same 4 properties come up. Orientation, X, Y, and Z rotation. If you're ever going to animate the rotation of a 3D layer, I would highly suggest that you do it using the X, Y, and Z properties, not the orientation, unless the rotation is going to be very slight. And the reason for that is because you should think about orientation as just that, the orientation of the layer. So let's use this sun as an example, or actually let's use this one in the middle here. I'll press R again to bring up the rotation. Right now, this layer is oriented directly towards us. This is the neutral value of 0, 0, 0 on the X, Y, and Z orientation. If I take the X orientation and move it left or right, you see that this is tipping it up or down on the X axis. This is the X axis right here, so it's rotating around that. So if I orient it up a little bit, I orient it to the right a little bit by moving the Y axis, and then maybe rotate it on the Z as well. This layer is now oriented based on the orientation property, but you'll notice none of the rotation values have changed because these are all relative to the orientation of the layer. Now the reason why I say you should use these 3 properties to animate the rotation and not the orientation is because once you get to 360 degrees, you see that it just loops around back down to 0. So let me set this all back down to 0 real quick. So we're back at our neutral value. And let's say that I want to rotate this all the way around 360 degrees. I'll set a keyframe on the orientation, go forward maybe 20 frames, and then rotate this around until it's gone 360 degrees around. So I'm just gonna keep turning it until I see 360, it goes back down to 0. Now let's set our work area. I pressed N on the keyboard to move the end of my work area to this point and play this back. Nothing's happening. And that's because the orientation just cycles back around to 0. There's nothing in between that, even though I cycled that all the way around 360 degrees. So you might think, well, if I move it back a couple of degrees, then it'll go around from 0 to 356. Well, let's see what happens there. Basically nothing. If we zoom in really close, you can see that it is just slightly rotating because it's not going all the way around in the direction that we spun it. It's going in whichever direction that value has the least amount of change. So instead of counting from 0 to 360, it's just backing up from 0 and counting down to the value that we had it set to, 356. And it's always going to go in the direction that it has less value to change with. So let me get rid of these keyframes, and instead I'll go to the Y-axis rotation, and I'll set a keyframe at 0. I'll go forward, and then I'll rotate this around 360 degrees. And as soon as I get to 360, you'll notice this goes back to 0, but we have 1 cycle or 1 revolution counted up. So now if we play this back, it's spinning and it's looping, so it looks like it's spinning forever. Now I can change the orientation of this layer to whatever I want, and those rotation values that we animated are all relative to that orientation. So that is a very important concept to understand with 3D layers. And it also applies to 3D cameras. So let's reset this back down to 0 and take a look at our actual camera. So adjusting the orientation will adjust where the camera is looking. And if I switch to my camera tool and click and drag, you'll notice that the orientation is what is being modified. But things are slightly different with the camera because generally you're not going to be spinning the camera around and around and around like I was with that sun. You're just going to orient the camera towards what you want it pointed at. So if I adjust the orientation value, it's going to change what the camera is looking at. And I can change the angle on the Z-axis so that it kind of looks like we're tilting the camera one way or another. And if I switch to my camera tool, this is going to be modifying the orientation property, not the X, Y, and Z rotations. Now, this is not to say that you can't use the X, Y, and Z properties to animate the rotation. And in some instances, you might want to do that just so you can have access to the individual properties. But 99% of the time, when I animate a 3D camera, using keyframing the orientation is just fine. So if I point the camera over towards this sun and set a keyframe, and then I go forward and I point it over here, it's going to add that keyframe and it's just going to animate between those two orientations. And that works great. Still, you have the option to adjust the rotation or animate the rotation with the separated dimensions or just the combined orientation. Okay, so I'll delete these keyframes and I'll set this back down to 0. But those are the transform properties that we have access to in this type of camera. There's actually one more that we don't see yet, but we're going to talk about that later. For now, let's collapse up that transform controls, and in the next video, we'll take a look at the camera options.